Okay, in this section, we're going to start at 172 and we're going to go through to 191 of the lieutenant. And so in this section, it describes a really beautiful interaction between Rook or number of interactions between Rook and Tagaran and a few other native people. So one of note on 173 is with Warringon. And so Warringon is described as often silent. So he'll often sit and it'll take him half an hour to start speaking, which in a way Rook describes as a peculiar sort of mirror because amongst his own kind, he is the one who makes others uneasy with his silences. But Warrigan also doesn't seem to find silence awkward. And so sometimes Warrigan arrives with others and there's a description of when Warringun is with the other men, then he's not quite as stern and he tells stories and he is a mimic. So he kind of maybe turns it into a bit of a parody. He pantomime. He makes fun of some of the English officers, and on 174, the middle area, there's a description of Warrigan giving Rook language lessons. And it's interesting how what he teaches, though, tends to be the men's business, the spear, the different names of the spheres, types of spears, so they're tools. Warrigan doesn't seem to like writing down the words, but he's still patient nonetheless. And the kids, though, Tarragon, Warrigan, Bonetta, the three of them, often, Tarragon, Warrigan and Bonetta, oh gosh. Here we go, come on. Yeah, they often hover around his camp as well. And so Tagaran actually gives Lieutenant Rook a name. The name is Kamara, which means my friend. He's not sure where it comes from, whether it was from her language or whether it's some form of the English word comrade, or it's just chance. But he likes the fact that he's named Kamara. He has a name in her language. Tagaran on 175, bottom, is described as being a natural leader. She just has that quality, the effortless authority that some people have. Silk and Gardner just have that air of authority, whereas the governor doesn't have it, but Tagaran does. So he says it's more than intelligence, although Tagaran is intelligent like Quicksilver, and it's more than just assertiveness, although she is also assertive. He says it's more like a fearless engagement with the world. And she's learning English with him as he is learning the native tongue as well. And 177, let's pop over there. Middle of 177, this section here talks about the fact that language goes in both directions. So they have started making some of the English words their own. So bread is now bredo. It's become part of their language. So the explanation is not simply borrowed, but possessed. So we actually call them loan words in linguistics when they're words that have been taken into another tongue. We have lots of them in English. We have them from like all languages. But here there's an explanation that it doesn't just go one way. It's not just the natives who are taking the indigenous words, but he also takes, it's not just the natives taking English words, but he also starts to make his own version of a mixed language, I guess. So he's learnt about a throwing stick called a woomera, and that is what a woomera looks like, by the way. And I think it's supposed to have a shell on the end there, because here there is a shell blade called a cardigan. It sounds a little bit like a cardigan that you that you wear, but a cardigan on the end. And he explains how to say to change the cardigan or add the cardigan, and he says, I cardiganed it, the English word he meant, which I think might be I shell bladed it. I have no idea what that would mean, but basically I cardiganed it represents remaking the language into his own. So it represents the fact that the language is now becoming blended, as are the cultures as they're mixing. That is beautifully described on the next page. Like ink in water, one language was melting into another. And I also said it represents the cultures melting into each other, and also friendship and identity too. It's a crossing of those boundaries. And then from page 178, for a few pages here, there's a description of Tagaran heating herself up after she's gotten wet. And so she comes in and wants to stand in front of the fire, and he gives her his jacket. And that's a very Western thing to do. If someone's cold, you give them some extra clothes. But she doesn't want that. She actually says she'll actually stay, she'll get warmer if she stays naked, because the heat of the fire, she can stand in front of the fire and it will warm her quicker. And he writes that down, the explanation here. And you can imagine this little bit of italics coming from William Dawes' original notebooks. And she says, I will or do remain longer naked in order to get warm sooner, rather than put on the clothes. And then 181, Rook is washing and shaving, and then he asks her with a towel to wash herself. And so she dips the towel into water and then kind of copies what he does. And then he makes a joke. This section, he says, if you wash yourself often enough, you will become white. He didn't know whether she'd understand, or he's translating them into actions. He thought it was a funny joke, a bit of absurdity that a child would appreciate. But then she, shocked, rubs her arm with the towel and throws it down like she's like all offended. In a pet, it says. And he thinks she says something like, I shall not become white. And she's pouting. And he is very upset that he's offended her, and he curses himself for such a badly judged bit of tomfoolery. But then she winks at him, and he realizes that she's not acting, but overacting. And he kind of made it as a joke, and she ran with it. She took hold of the joke and ran further with it, give it another twist. And they laughed with pleasure at what they made together, a joke. But then this next section I thought was quite important, that it did leave a taint of something else, a sense of the ease with which such a thing could go wrong. He must be careful, he told himself. The rapport between them was easy, but he can't make assumptions. There's too much to lose, and not just the glory of being the first to speak the native tongue. I think here is the first time we recognise that it's more than just glory or fame, but he's actually developing a relationship. And I made a little note that there could be a link to Political Correctness Today, that the ease of which things can go wrong. And then Tagaran and Warrigan decide that they're going to have a sleepover at his house. But they're going to sleep, and they ask permission by the couple of natives who are at the fire, and they agree they can sleep over at Mr. Rook's house. He shares his food. He makes some sweet tea, and this bit is quite interesting. He now gets a name for the tea. The tea is called Warrabura, and the bottom of 184, this is here. So he sips a cup of Warrabura, and he has grown more fond of it than of real tea, enjoying the way its faintly aniseed, faintly astringent, faintly sweet taste left him feeling refreshed and his spirits somehow clearer. And I thought perhaps this could symbolise his fondness of the culture and the language. So he's grown more fond of the natives than of his British counterparts. And so he finds it an odd pleasure to have the girls staying with him. He doesn't think he's ever played host before, and they sleep in front of the fireplace. Tagaran gives orders. She gives a lot of orders. He calls him such a bossy child, and insists on the blanket. Give me the blanket. He has, at the bottom of 185, a longing to protect and an imperative to stand aside. 186 we are now. So he takes his extra blanket, puts it over the girls. He acknowledges that blanket would not be comfortable, but comfort wasn't the point. The point was that Tagaran wanted to feel the very texture of the white man's world. And it's similar to what he wants to experience, that very texture of the natives' world, perhaps. He describes in his journal the interaction. Over, I will not become white. And then he explains at the bottom here of 186. It's a beautiful, beautiful quote for you to learn here. The heart of talking, and which two people find common grounds and begin to discover the true names of things, which represents that genuine connection. And it's also the title of this section, part 3, but certainly worth learning this as a quote. So the heart of talking, begin to discover the true names of things. And he recognizes that it's so hard to write these down in a notebook when it's so much more than words or actions. What is the true names of things and the truth? And 188. So Tagaran makes a little mistake with her language here. She says, he says to her, why can't you sleep? And she says, put out the blanket. And he's like, huh? What do you mean put out the blanket? And then she corrects herself and says, oh, candle, because not the blanket, the candle. And then he makes a joke of it by puffing as if to blow out the blanket. 189, if you scroll there, there's a recognition. So it was unlike Tagaran to make a mistake. So he said, put out the blanket. She said, put out the blanket instead of put out the candle. But it was also unlike him to turn the mistake into a joke by trying to blow out the blanket. And then he recognised it might be unlike Daniel Rook, but for Camera, it seems to come naturally as breathing. Camera must have existed all this time, he thought, but without the remarkable chance arrival of Tagaran, he would still be voiceless. So this is that idea of the tabula rasa, that he is the blank slate, and Camera may have existed always inside, but Tagaran is the one who has brought him out of himself. He would be voiceless without her. He has a strong sense of warmth in his chest. He couldn't locate it or name it, but he knew it was to do with Tagaran being under his roof and the trusting hand One of her hands is flung out from between the blanket, palm up. And we recognize as the readers that it's a form of kinship, a form of love. And he feels like an ordinary man and not any other man who can't sleep. So he's watching the moon, but there's a sense of, because of his warmth and relationship, family kinship with Tagaran, that he now is as any other man. And we can skip over that, turn to page 191. There's a sense of his protectiveness there, that this might be what it's like to have children of one's own. And he thinks perhaps one day, I suppose, he would marry. And if he did, he would remember this moment, and he was trying to imagine himself or picture himself telling them the story of the one night the two native children slept inside his hut. And that's that up to 191.